Hey everyone, Mr. Happy here, and in this video, I want to have a discussion about raid buff alignment in Final Fantasy XIV. As the name so diligently implies, we're going to be talking about making sure that a party of 8's buffs are always going off at about the same time in any given encounter. That seems like something that should be second nature, right? They changed all the cooldowns in the game to pretty much be 60 seconds or 120 seconds, minus a few that are a few seconds off to make sure you have a little bit of leeway on when you use them. But that being said, when it comes to endgame raiding, there is some nuance. Things you've probably noticed but not given too much thought that can really improve your ability to clear. Now this is true whether you're going in with a set group of 8 and a static, or if you're going into the party finder and as many people are aware of how to align their buffs as possible. So I want to go through each of the most recent Savage encounters, talk about where buff alignment actually falls in those encounters, and things that you should consider when new encounters come out, trying to determine when the best time to use your buffs would be, because it's not as simple as just every minute or two. Now, despite saying it's not that easy, fortunately with the first encounter, we have a mostly solid set of examples. Now, I'm just going to pull up my first clears for all of these and kind of freeform discuss what you should be considering in each of these encounters. So, for the first encounter in Asphodelos Savage, there's really very few places where you need to think too much about where you're doing your 1 minutes, where you're doing your 2 minutes, etc., etc. For sake of the video, we started at about 14 seconds is when the boss was pulled. So we really just need to skip around every minute or so and talk about those specific timings and if anything important is happening and what the solutions would be in those given scenarios. So skipping ahead just 1 minute in, this is where you would have really mostly personal buffs, if anything. For example, I'll be having Sidewinder come up on Bard very soon. A ninja trick attack would be very important to track at these specific times, so if you do have a ninja in the group, this is a big thing to have to consider. But if you're a melee job, also considering your personal buffs at a 1 minute mark, can I hit the boss at that time? Is there something that makes it difficult, a mechanic going off at the same time? But those are the things you have to be thinking about. Unfortunately with this, it's just a simple in or out mechanic, one that doesn't even require you to stop hitting the boss. Now, actually skipping ahead to the 2 minute 14 second mark, we come to what looks to be a potentially scary moment, but one that still kind of works out. So we started the encounter at 2 minutes and 14 seconds. That means it's going to take 2 or 3 global cooldowns for everyone to get their buffs out. So you have about another 6 seconds or so to make sure that everybody is buffed. Yet we have a mechanic that's about to be beginning here. Now, what you'll often see is when people know a mechanic is coming, when they know where their spot is going to be for that mechanic, it's not uncommon to see people move out, get to their spot, because then they can just stay there and they can root there and they don't have to worry about moving at the last second or anything like that. However, with 2 minute buffs coming out at exactly this time, it's really more important to focus on not just when your 2 minutes go out, but how many people you will actually hit with your 2 minutes when they go out. One of the biggest mistakes people make with buff alignment is just pressing them on cooldown without considering what other mechanics are happening at the same time. If everybody goes to their spot and then pops 2 minutes here, you're going to miss half of the raid with your buffs, and that is tons of DPS you are losing, things that could be saving you in a party finder group where people may not be playing optimally and people may die or may get damage downs or things of that capacity. So in a case like this, when you know you need to spread right after raid buffs are supposed to go out, everyone should kind of hover near the middle of the room, make sure they're getting all those raid buffs, and then try to not necessarily do a last second movement, but a secure movement, one where okay, raid buffs have gone out, I've got Battle Voice, I've got Finale, I've got Litany, I've got all these things. Now I can take a step out and I can make sure that I actually am at full power. And that's true of the people buffing too. They need to know not to move out early. So it is really a group effort, but this is the first really basic example of something you need to do with 2 minutes is just make sure not to move away from the group too early. Now, skipping ahead to the 3 minute 14 second mark, again, these are just the simple 1 minutes that we're going to have, and there's really nothing happening here. There's about to be some raid damage going out, but that's really nothing to write home about, so we can skip ahead right to 4 minutes and 14 seconds approximately. Again, this is a very simple one. The mechanic forces everyone to be together for the next several seconds. There's no reason anybody should miss raid buffs at this time, unless they're dead, which is terribly unfortunate, but the time must go on. With all these 1 minutes and 2 minutes being on very strict timers, it's kind of tough when somebody's dead and 2 minutes are about to go out, because do you really want to wait for them to be up? They're weakened, they're delaying your timers, your things are falling out of alignment. So it's something worth considering. If maybe they're in the middle of the raise animation, delay it 1 global cooldown, but don't hold things 15, 20, 30 seconds if it's really going to hurt everyone in the long run. It's especially going to hurt If some people do that, they wait to make sure that everyone's buffs are going to come out at the same time and everyone's going to be alive for it. But then other people don't do it. It's just in a party finder group, you can't rely on people all being on the same page. So you do kind of just need to go with using your 2 minutes at a time like this, even if somebody were to be dead. It's just how it's going to happen most of the time. Now, there are other considerations, and we'll talk about that as we get close to the end of this first encounter. Jumping ahead, 514. Again, there's no like raid buffs that go out here. These are mostly personal buffs during the fourfold chains that you're seeing right here. So nothing too much to consider. Just make sure that you are actually hitting the boss when your buffs go out at a time like this. Now, Intemperance 1 had one lesson we had to learn about raid buff alignment, and that was making sure people didn't leave too early. Whereas the second Intemperance is a decent bit different because the mechanic is already ongoing at the 6 minute and 14 second mark. So buffs should be coming up right about now, and everyone's a little bit spread out. Now, fortunately, like I said, you have 2 or 3 global cooldowns. So let's go through here. We can see I've got my buffs being tracked at the bottom, so we can actually use them at a timer. So you can see right now is when all my buffs are up. We're about halfway through this Jailer's Flail, and I could probably get all of my buffs out before this Jailer's Flail. So this is a case of not only needing to make sure everyone's together, but that the mechanic doesn't interfere with that actually happening. If this were to be another 5 seconds later, when everyone has to be spread all around the room, you would actually need to hold your 2 minutes for a little bit of time to make sure that everyone comes back to the center, collects those buffs, and then pops off. It can be unfortunate because there are some buttons you just really can't afford to not press every minute or two, or you don't know how to incorporate them into your rotation. Will you overcap resources? Will you just get lost because it's just not muscle memory? There's all sorts of possibilities with this, but it's something you have to consider. Fortunately with this, it kind of falls in the line of the first Intemperance. Make sure everybody's together towards the middle of the room for these buffs before you do the follow-up mechanic. Fortunately, everyone has to be north, south, or middle here. So the only things that are slightly under consideration are the people who are in front of the boss and behind the boss being too far. But again, you could always wait a few seconds, or you can really just try to give them the buffs and then quickly get to the spot. These are the little things that you have to kind of finesse to find out exactly what's comfortable for your individual job in order to make it work. Now, jumping ahead to the rest of the fight, there's really nothing that stops you from doing your raid buffs with everyone. I'm going to actually jump to about 9:14, 9:15. So actually 8:14, 8:15 approximately, which for us is coming up near the end of the encounter. Now, this is where some other skills come into play, things that you likely won't consider much in the Party Finder unless you're in a very specialized group for it. And that is the overall fight, of the length of the fight, the total encounter time. Because depending on how much time the encounter is expected to take, whether that be the actual enrage timer or just the average time it takes a group to actually kill it, could determine what you're able to do with your 1 minute and 2 minute buffs. You may have to drift them, you may have to move them, or you may have to pop them immediately. In the case of this fight, we have deaths, we have damage downs, but by the time the encounter is actually done, we're at about 8 minutes and 50 seconds. Let's just say, because I'm at 8:49 right now and the boss is about to be dead. That means that in the case of, well, it's more like 8 minutes and I guess 33 seconds because I started the encounter at 14 seconds into the video. So that means that with our 2 minute buffs, we have approximately 15 to 20 seconds on earlier windows to consider adjusting them in places like Intemperance 1 and Temperance 2. You know, if we're like, oh, you know, if we just wait 10 seconds here, we can use them and we'll still get another use of them at the end. But if we were to kill this boss another 15, 20 seconds faster, then all of a sudden we're barely even getting off that last set of 2 minutes at about the 8:15 mark like we were showing earlier. So now we have to consider, how do we want to use the time that we have? Because if we go under the 8 minute mark, now we're only going to get, you know, buffs at 0, 2, 4, and 6. Is there some sort of benefit to maybe delaying the third set to 4 minutes and 40 seconds so that we can use pots? You know, is that 30-second delay, 40-second delay actually going to be worth it? Now, things like this you likely won't consider in places like the Party Finder. It is most important just to go with what the most likely places would be for 2 minutes and not worry too much about overall encounter length. But when you are trying to do cutting edge content on the first week, especially with the later encounters, that becomes a very, very, very important thing. So we'll talk about that a little bit later because it plays a big role in one of the later encounters. So that covers mostly everything for the first encounter. It teaches you a few basic lessons, and then you can move on to the second one. Now, it's been a while since I've actually reviewed this encounter and what the timings actually are, so consider this a little bit of a learning experience for me. And I actually do recommend, if you can record your footage, if you can record your perspective, whether it's a win or a loss, it's very, very good to go back and look through what just happened on a previous pull, or if you're done raiding for tonight, to rewatch and see where mistakes were being made, if buff alignment could be better. It just really helps again on those early clears, on those week 1 clears, and even with more casual clears with groups that are just tackling it a few hours a night, maybe a few times a week. Now again, we have this part at the beginning where all of our buffs are going out, and so my buffs go out about 34 seconds into the video. So we'll use that as the reference point, 30 to 34, which makes it nice and easy. We can just jump to the 130, 135 mark approximately. Again, we should probably just skip all the 1 minutes for the rest of this video. I think the point is made about these mostly being personal buffs and needing to make sure you're in range. So we're just going to skip to the 2 minutes for the rest of the video for the most part. So going over to the 2 minute, and let's do 2 minute and 32 second marker. You can see this is a wonderful time for 2 minutes. In fact, I'm in the middle of pressing them now. We're all together. There's no reason for anyone to be spread out. The mechanic even demands that people be relatively close together. This is one of those ideal press it when it's ready situations. Go nuts. So we can skip right ahead to the next 2 minute mark, about 4 minutes 30 right here. Now this is actually a great case of showcasing when it's okay to just hold buffs, when you just need to know it's not worth it. And if you've done the extreme trials, you've probably run into this situation because they are notorious for causing people to have bad 2 minute alignment. So right after this boss uses this knockback, buffs are coming up right now, right as the shockwave is going out. But there's about to be a massive amount of movement. So fortunately, this clears one of the things you need to consider. Everyone's together. If I were to press my 2 minutes, I would hit everyone, and theoretically, we'd all get the greatest benefit out of it, right? Unfortunately, the next mechanic is such a mad dash that odds are you're going to actually lose a decent amount of damage. And this is another lesson when it comes to raid buffs. It's not just about if you can apply it to everyone, it's if the boss will become untargetable while you are still buffed. Will you actually lose buff uptime because of a boss mechanic? And in this case with Campeos Harma, you absolutely would, because the boss goes completely untargetable just roughly 10 seconds after we were going to press those buff windows. Not to mention, you have melee players that may need to move across the map depending on how efficient your group is with their placement here. You have people that need to run to the opposite side no matter what. People are checking their numbers. Nobody's playing optimally in a situation like this. So not only will you actually lose buff time in a situation like this, but you'll just lose focus, which eats a lot and a lot of the power you're going to have. So for a situation like this where a mechanic is going to screw you over, you naturally want to delay 2 minutes. And this is definitely a situation where I would consider doing it. Because look, we can't do anything during all this time. It would have worn off like in the middle of all these dashes and everything. Instead, we wait until we're all coming back together right here. And as soon as we're back together, we can actually do our 2 minutes. Now, one thing I didn't do in this video, not crucial to the video, but definitely something worth noting, is that my potion actually came up in the middle of that mechanic. So I can use a grade 6 dex pot right now, and I would be able to benefit from it. A lot of the times when you're doing 2 minutes on cooldown, you have to skip that pot either being at the 4 minute mark, or you have to use it at 2 minutes and then wait till 8 minutes into the encounter. So pot timing becomes another really important thing to consider with buff alignment, because that's one of your strongest buffs. If everyone in your team uses a pot every time it's available, the gains are beyond substantial, more than people would probably think. It just creates so much outliers in your actual log that it allows you to offset your average and really raise it. So maximizing the use on those is super important. This would have been a totally viable place for me to use it. I didn't. I will use it later, I think. I haven't watched this clear VOD in a while, so we'll see about that statement. But you do have to consider those things. Is it worth it doing it at 0 minutes right at the start, and then at 6 minutes, which is when it would naturally align with your 2 minutes without you having to do any funky delays? Is there a mechanic that lets me get my pot as soon as it becomes available? And does that actually buy me another pot use later in the fight? Will I get one at 9 minutes now? And at 9 minutes, realistically, is a question of, will I get it at about 10 minutes and 30 seconds? So is the encounter even long enough for me to get another one? Is this the best time? Do I have all my resources? Was there something that downtime cost me that I'm not going to get back? all these little things that you need to consider, at least for your personal buffs. There is also the consideration of using your pots at 2 minutes and 8 minutes. A lot of jobs are stronger at 2 minutes than they are right at the start of the fight, Bard being one of them. So if the encounter is long enough and you know you're only going to get 2 pots anyway, you can consider doing that as well. And that can be something you make an individual decision about. Not everyone needs to use their pot at the same time, just need to make sure they actually line up with 2 minutes. So now that my 2 minutes have drifted to 5 minutes and 5 seconds into the video, we can jump ahead to 7 minutes and 5 seconds and see what's going on here. And as you can see, we're all together. Everything's good to go. I don't need to talk much about that. It's just the ideal situation going into any sort of mechanic. So we can skip ahead to what we can presume would be the last set of buffs. And I think we actually have a really bad time here. So this might be another example of, yeah, that's a bad time, all right. Our first clear wasn't our cleanest. Now, in a situation like this, ideally when this mechanic is done correctly, the only concern you really have is that your tank is on the other side of the room. And I know you're thinking, oh, they're a tank, it's fine if they miss buffs. Yeah, you really don't want it to be the case. You really want to make sure that you actually hit every single person with it. So because of the mechanics going out here, I would personally recommend saving your buffs till after the coherence cast, and then just doing it once the tank is able to run back. You can even do it while the flow people are running out, because you are usually getting pretty close to the end of the fight. These are going to be your last 2 minutes no matter what. So hitting everyone is crucial. If you have to wait for the second set of flows to resolve, so be it. If it means everybody can get hit and it means nobody's stunned during their buffs, which will happen to the second set of flows if you were to pop 2 minutes at just about now. But if everyone dies, then, well, everyone will be getting up in a second. And then you can pop your 2 minutes, and hopefully nobody else dies from the healer LB3 saving whatever mistake was made. Sorry, Zeph. I see you going off in the corner over there. But that's it. That's a fight that's very straightforward, very little consideration. Just have to think about that downtime that comes from Campeos Harma, and you should be A-okay. All right, now we get a little bit more into the fun stuff. Now, while it's the fourth encounter I think is the most interesting to talk about buff alignment, this encounter does have a few nuances that you need to consider as well. Fortunately, nothing all too major. So first, let's of course find when we actually start the pull, as we have been for the previous ones, and that'll be our timing. So I'm pressing battle voice right now, so let's just say the 40 seconds, so 2 minutes 40, 4 minutes 40. That'll be our baseline before we start moving things around. So let's jump over to 240, see what's happening. Look at that. We are all grouped up together. It's beautiful. It's wonderful. We're all moving to the same location. Now, there is actually something to talk about here, and I kind of sped through it there when my voice got a little fast. In that this is a mechanic that doesn't always dictate that everybody needs to go in the same direction. So much like with previous situations where it's about people not going too far or making sure they group up before you use them, this is a situation where everybody needs to be on the same page about what direction is actually being moved. So if this were to be the other possible mechanic here, where the only place that's not safe is in the middle, and sometimes people run off to the side, having a designated spot for your group to always go is important, because while we're doing this movement, buffs are about to go out. I am fortunately pressing mine as I move out, so everyone's already stacked, nobody will miss mine, but it is still something that's definitely important to consider. Now we're going to jump ahead to the next section. This one gives people a few questions. So this is what I like to call when you consider what's optimal for your buffs versus considering what you need to use your buffs for. So right now we're looking at the add phase for this encounter, and at about the time where our next set of buffs come up, there are sunbirds that we need to kill. Now, if you've been having a clean run and everyone's playing semi-okay, then you don't need to use 2 minutes on these birds. There's nothing that they need from you other than your global cooldown and to make sure you're pressing a semi-optimal button. However, if people have died, if there's weaknesses, or if people are just underperforming, then you might actually need to consider just popping a buff here and just making sure that these things go down. It's not uncommon during progression rating in particular for you to actually have to make a decision like this. First time seeing to the end of this mechanic, you pop all your 2 minutes. You're not considering about, oh, that's not going to be optimal, you know, these things are going to die and it's just going to be sitting here not hitting. You just need to make sure the mechanic goes, and that's an okay decision to have to make, especially when you're doing pickup group style content. Now, that being said, there are some other nuances here. For one, we want to actually save our 2 minutes if we can until the boss becomes targetable. Now, if we actually go a little bit further for our first clear, that was about 15 to 16 seconds after the clip that we just had. So we're looking at about 4:56 into the video. Now, there's a couple of interesting things that happen here. This is another one of those cases where we had downtime, where we weren't using buffs and we were actually getting close to our 4 minute and 30 second mark. That's when our potion is going to become available. And this is another one of those places where you have to consider, maybe I need to use my pot here so that way I can get another one later. And in the case of this encounter, if you do use your pot at the 6-minute mark, then whether or not you get another is fairly questionable. But if you can use it here, you can guarantee you'll get another pot a little bit later, unless your kill speed is ridiculous, which at this point, it very likely won't be. So maybe the ad phase runs on long enough. Maybe it takes you long enough to kill the small sunbirds and the big sunbirds, and you actually get your pot before the boss even becomes retargetable. There are a lot of groups that are even trying to do this on purpose to make sure that their actual boss DPS is higher than what it would normally be here if you were to actually kill it just as quickly as possible. There is also the consideration that if it takes just long enough for your pot to maybe be 1 or 2 seconds off, that you could actually use it at that point. You know, you could just kind of filter it in somewhere there to make sure that it gets used during buffs in some way, shape, or form. Not an ideal use, but something you may want to consider if it does mean getting an extra pot. But again, we held our 2 minutes for this. You can see it on my buff bar right now. I'm about to start popping them. And this is where we all agreed as a team that they would be. And that's a very important aspect of 2-minute alignment. Now again, we jump ahead. Let's see what's at the 6-minute and 56-second mark. Oh boy. This is one of those cases where you may want to wait a second. Now, thankfully, because we delayed it a little bit before, these are kind of almost naturally delayed a few seconds longer. So it's going to be another, I can see even on my battle voice timer here, 6 seconds before this is actually going to be a place where I can pop them. Now, 6 seconds from now, I'm just about wrapping up a mechanic. So you can see I'm passing through this. You can kind of see that I'm passing through the boss right now and my cooldowns are about to come up. This is one of those cases where you just wait a global cooldown or 2. You know there's a healer on the opposite side of the room. You know you're running away from somebody who's running towards the spot you just were. And so if you were to, just do it on the way there, you might miss everyone. I won't even be in the middle of the room when my buffs actually come up. This is a nice case of just wait 1 or 2 global cooldowns. It likely won't be the end of the world. You might miss something that's normally in those buffs, but at the very best, then you're still going to be hitting everybody, and that's definitely the more important aspect. Now, jumping ahead to about 9 minutes, we'll get another look at what's going on over there. Now, 9 minutes in this encounter is actually a pretty scary time. So I actually need to jump ahead a little bit because I delayed my buffs there. Again, they're a little bit more naturally delayed here. So now I have to consider what the new timing looks like. And fortunately, because of that delay in the previous mechanic, I'm getting my buffs right here after all those previous mechanics have resolved. Sometimes delaying a buff earlier in the fight makes your later alignments better without even you really needing to consider it. So that's another thing to definitely think about when you're doing your 2 minutes. If I use them right away, just because I think, I need to use them, is it going to screw me later? Am I going to have to use it at an inoptimal or unoptimal time at a later point in the fight? And yes, the answer would definitely be yes in this case, 9 minutes into this, about 8.5 minutes into the actual encounter. Now, at this point, the fight's getting pretty close to done. You can see that by the time our 2 minutes come up again, we're at the Enrage cast. So we have basically given the maximum amount of time that we could possibly give, because we will actually get a full set of 2 minutes if the boss were to survive long enough here. And that's important because if you can end the fight on your last set of 2 minutes, that means that your optimization was as on point as possible. You got every possible use out of it, wasted not a single second, and did all the right alignments. It won't always work out this way, but when it's this close on a longer encounter, especially in the early raid tiers, this is the kind of stuff you like to see, is that last use ending right as the fight ends, because that's when everyone ends on a high, and that's when everybody feels really good about that last little burst they gave to finish the boss. And then we come to the 4th encounter, which is probably the best example of an absolute disaster when it comes to buff alignment, because the amount of concessions you may need to make in an encounter like this is incredibly high, and people who are unwilling or feel unable to make adjustments in an encounter like this can make a huge difference given the strictness of the later encounters in a Savage tier. Now, we actually pulled the boss about 10 seconds from now, so it looks like the 10-second mark right here, yeah, that'll be approximately it, give or take a few seconds for buff. So here at the start, again, there's nothing to really talk about or consider. We really need to jump right ahead to the 2 minute and 10-second mark. And unfortunately, this encounter, the very first place you need to use raid buffs, can sometimes look like this, with everyone all over the place and everybody just no way you're hitting everyone. Now, fortunately, there are two ways to approach a situation like this. Normally in early weeks, while buff alignment is going to be your goal, you're normally doing it with suboptimal strats. Like this was kind of just our default. We need to get this fight done. We want to get it done in the first couple of days. So we'll just do what makes the most sense. We'll get on a half of the room that's open. We'll all spread and we'll make sure that we just don't die. Whereas strategies eventually develop that allow you to move buff alignment around. There's another strat going around now where you can actually bring the boss to a set location. We actually almost unironically have the boss in the uptime location, and that allows you to approach a situation entirely differently. You can now group up and get a lot closer during the buff timers. So early weeks, you may have to do one thing with your 2 minutes. Here, we were trying to hold them until we all got back into the middle of the room because this was our solution to this type of mechanic, and this mechanic doesn't even always go this way every time we do it. But in the later weeks, including this week, we've now been working on improving our strategy so we can make sure our alignment is smoother, is cleaner, is happening at an earlier point. Because of the actual encounter length, we have a little bit of space to work with, and we're working to make sure that our team is as in sync as they can possibly be. But you'll see right here, as soon as that wraps up, as soon as I get closer to the center of the room, this is when our team agreed we would be popping our buffs. Now, another lesson here, this is still a lot of movement and it's still a very random mechanic. There's no guarantee that the way this mechanic is happening in this pull, it will happen this way every time. So there is the consideration of what if we just hold our buffs for 20 more seconds? And now we're playing the game of, will we lose a use of buffs at the end if we delay our buffs to, let's say, from the 2 minute and 10 second mark to the 2 minute and 30 second mark? And fortunately, with an encounter like this, the answer is no. But there are going to be encounters where the answer is yes. If you do not use it at exactly the time it comes up, you lose a use. And we're actually going to get to talk about that a little bit soon. So while this is what we agreed on in Prague, you have to consider what's more optimal. Is waiting till everyone's done with the movement, waiting till you see exactly what mechanics everyone's getting before making a big decision like that and deciding to group up. But fortunately, we all hit each other with buffs here. We've all got them running. And we managed to make at least semi-decent use of them here. And that's at the very least what you're looking to achieve with something like this. Now jumping ahead again to, let's do about, okay, we actually got to go back a little bit. I overestimated how far I'd watched the video. You got to go right about here to the 4 minute and 16 second mark. As you can see, everyone in the center of the room, not really much to discuss. Now, if we had delayed our buffs 20 more seconds like we were discussing there, where would we be? What would be happening right now? Let's jump ahead a little bit. Would you look at that? We'd still be standing together. So it'd still be absolutely perfect. The alignment here is not messed up by moving the earlier alignment. So that's worth a consideration for later attempts. And then we jump ahead to the 6 minute and what? That was 6 minutes 30. So let's go back to 6 minutes and about 15. And would you look at that? It is the not so great mechanic again. And our buffs are about to come out again. And this pretty much poses the exact same issue as before. Should we delay them? The answer is almost certainly going to be a solid yes. And as you can see, again, our team agreed to just do them when we come back to the middle of the room. Again, we agreed to it. And again, it's fixable in the exact same way the first one was. Fortunately, even if we had delayed them on the first one, these would be naturally delayed till about now. And as you can see, now is not an issue. We can all pop them. It wouldn't be a problem. Even if we have to spread out here, we could pop them and then spread out, and it would be perfectly okay. But even if we delayed them both times, we have another like 20 to 25 seconds here to work with. So there's really not much to be worried about. Sometimes you just have to make the weird decisions, even if it feels weird in your rotation. Sometimes you just got to do it for the greater good. And in this case, we had a lot of room to work with the greater good. We made it work, but we can always do better. Now, unfortunately, we have to talk about phase 2 of this fight. Now, that's not a bad thing. The second part of the encounter is great. I love it. But when it comes to buff alignment, this thing is a natural disaster waiting to happen. Groups that do not think about this are going to struggle definitely as much as we did week 1. We cleared it on the second day, but when we looked back at our raid buff alignment, we kind of just had people doing whatever and not really focusing on what would be the optimal alignment. We just wanted to get through, and we didn't take enough pulls to really fix it. So right here at the beginning, again, we just need to set that kind of standard for the start. So I press my buffs here. It's literally 8 minutes. Now, unfortunately, we're working with an encounter here that maxes out at 8 minutes and 25 seconds. When you have an encounter that maxes out so close to an even numbered minute, when all your best buffs are every other even minute, that means that in our best case scenario, our last set of raid buffs has to come up at about 8:05 to 8:10, and we only have 15 to 20 seconds to finish the boss at that point. That is very scary because it means any drift on 2 minutes anywhere in the encounter will force you to lose uptime on your buffs towards the end. And this is probably the most difficult encounter to make sure your 2 minutes are actually used appropriately, because it actually requires entire strategy changes to make it so it is completely flawless. And it's something that most people probably won't achieve without a lot of work, especially not in random groups. So we start with this 8-minute, and then we go over to the 10-minute. So let's go to just about here. This is literally, I'm pressing battle voice as we are going right here because we're about to group up. And you can see how few people are around me. I've got, who is that? A healer, a tank, and I think another healer on my right. And I'm just like, okay, I have to press these here. I actually delayed it, so thank goodness I did. I think I hit most everyone with that. Let me, can I take a look at my buff bar? I can't even see it on the buff bar right now. It's not working out. I think I hit almost everybody. Yeah, it looks like I hit the DPS on the other side. But delaying it, that one GCD, I just delayed it, that now counts against me at the end of the fight. Like, okay, I hit everybody here. That's one less global cooldown with buffs at the end of the fight. And sometimes it's those last few seconds that are really scary. The other question is, did other people do that? I can see that I have my buffs. I can see I have Radiant Finale. I can see that I have Battle Voice, my own Raging Strikes. I can see I have Arcane Circle. Was there anything I don't have right here? What am I missing? It looks like I don't have Litany, for example. I have a hard time seeing if Div is there, but I don't think Div is there either. So it's just tough because, oh no, I did. I just got Divination. It's literally right there. But this little like change to our alignment, making sure we're back in the middle, this could have easily completely fallen apart. However, with a quick strategy change, you can see we're going all the way to the wall for this mechanic. But if you, well, I guess you can't pause there because you can't see anything. Let's go back a little bit so I can make an example of this. But as you can see, if you actually look a little bit closer into the center of the room, there's a spot where we can actually get close to the other side of the room. And what that allows me to do is snapshot those AoEs on the outside. And when it happens a few seconds later over here, right around the time 2 minutes come out, instead of me being on the wall and having to wait that extra GCD, if I'm closer to the center here, I can take 2 steps forward and suddenly I'm in range of everyone. I don't have to delay a GCD. It's saved. It's something very small, but with a fight like this that's so tight at the end, I have to talk about it. I have to consider it. So moving on to the 11-minute and 51-second mark, approximately, once again, we're in the middle of a major mechanic. I've got 6 seconds until my buffs go out. And once again, look where everyone is. This is almost unavoidable. It's coming up at this exact second. I can't do anything about this. The only solution we realistically would have would be to delay doing the entire mechanic or to wait until everybody is grouped up again. And that sucks. Now, I'll say this. If I had gotten that buff out of GCD earlier at that previous mechanic, I could have gotten it out before everybody left. So suddenly, that one global cooldown, that thing that seems so minuscule across the entire fight, is now hinging on whether I can even buff my team in time for this, which then hinges on whether I can do it at the end. So it's just a complete waterfall of just bad things that are happening in a row that make just such weird concessions that we have to make for one another. Now, I did make the call that we should wait to do our 2 minutes so we're back. Of course, it's week 1, so I'm playing like absolute doo-doo. But now that we're all back together, okay, sure, you know, it's going to be about the time for 2 minutes, so I'm doing them right here. You know, we're grouped together. I waited a second. You can see that we have, you know, Arcane Circles at 13, and, you know, I've got Litany. So we managed to make that kind of work, but they're all also, they're drifted from one another. Litany's almost done, whereas Battle Voice is that, and then you have time, like, they're all sort of drifted to some degree. And then you're going to see at the end what the actual final result is of all of this. So we're going to jump ahead another 2 minutes right about here. Right about here. Oh, no. So we actually have one more mechanic. So this one also not too bad, but that's only because we drifted on the previous one. We actually have a ton of time here in the center. So if we had popped those earlier, we'd actually be getting our buffs. Actually, we'd have them already right about now. And that would be ideal because then when we skip ahead another 2 minutes to the point I was actually trying to talk about, we've got 33 seconds left on my Battle Voice. This encounter ends in like 43 seconds. I'm going to be popping that as the boss is casting their Enrage animation. You're going to see that, I think, right here in a second. And you get to see how incredibly close it is. Look, this cast right here, this Ultimate Impulse, this is the Enrage. This is the end of the encounter. When that finishes, we're done. My Battle Voice is 1 second left. Now, I could have done something a little different here. I could have popped Radiant Finale earlier, knowing full well that comes up 10 seconds earlier. It comes with a great amount of flexibility. Even if I had popped it with only 2 of my buffs up, that is 4% damage people would have had 10 seconds before now. Instead of trying to keep that 100% perfect buff alignment, this is my rotation, I have to stick to it. That is a decision I could have made that would have made this clear not nearly as close as it actually was. And it would have totally been worth it because we have an LB1. Everyone's trying to pop their buffs. We've got like 9 seconds till the fight ends. I've got 17 seconds on Arcane Circle, 20 seconds on Finale. I haven't even pressed Battle Voice and Finale yet. And you could just see how quickly it falls apart. And considering how close this is at the end, that's make or break. There's almost nowhere for you to go from it. I just literally keyboard, look at me keyboard roll over all my buttons in desperation. Just make them go. Just make them go. And ended up being a clear in the end. But that's the fear of knowing that you have half of your buff timers left on your clear and that you are not going to get to use them, and that if you could use them even a few seconds earlier, that's going to make the difference. This is one of those encounters where your buff alignment can be nothing but flawless if you want to make sure you have that final push at the end. So that is why I'm having this discussion. It's not just because I see people wasting 2 minutes on intemp 1 or 2 by letting people not be in the center of the room. It's not because people are using them before limit cut in 2. It's because we have encounters like this where it is everything to make sure you consider when your pots are going to be, when your buffs are going to be, and if you can improve the strategy to make sure that those things work better. This encounter, the way we did it week 1, this is something that needs to be improved so that we can make sure our buff alignment is spotless in the following weeks. That was a fun little discussion we had about all the encounters and talking about the different effects on 2-minute alignments. You'd think they make everything 1 and 2 minutes. That makes it all nice and clean. It doesn't always, unfortunately. But with that, that's it for the video. I can do more of these in the future. I'm sure people want to know buff alignments for other encounters as they come out, and it's a fun little discussion to have. So if you like this, be sure to like, favorite, subscribe, and share, and stay tuned, of course, videos, as if I need to tell you, right? Anyway, I'll see you in the next one, and until then, take care.